which is the U.S. and China technology competition, if you will, or whatever you want to call it, confrontation, which of course has come to the fore in the last particularly 2 years, and but it was brewing for a long time because it drags so many other parts of the world into this, right? And I mean, there's all this discussion about choosing sides, et cetera. I think some of that's overblown. But we at Eurasia Group, we have clients on all sides of this, and do a lot of work on various pieces of it. My exposure to the China issue started in 1988 when I could barely make a phone call from Beijing to Xi'an, where I would eventually teach English. And then a number of years later, I was wrote one of the first cables from the U.S. Embassy in Beijing about the Great Firewall going up in China, which you could argue started some of this decoupling that people are talking about. And then fast forward, 2 years ago, or 3 years ago, I was riding my first high-speed rail from Beijing to Shanghai with a perfect Wi-Fi connection and cellular connection. So I had seen China go from sort of a backwater technologically, at least in the ICT space, to being sort of at least leading or at the cutting edge of some areas. So I think that's one perspective that I at least bring to this. But of course, there's lots of angles to this. And then in 2018, I started using on my Twitter feed this term U.S.-China Tech Cold War, which I found out later that Paul Moser from New York Times, a good friend, had used in an obscure 2015 article about U.S. and China. And so we agreed that we were sort of like these two scientists discovering the same thing on both sides of the Atlantic, and so we gave each other credit for coining that term. Now, obviously, it's gotten a lot of flack. Some people have attacked it. It's not a very exact term, but it's an attempt to capture some of the dynamic. And one of the main parts of it is the idea that there's sort of these two technology ecosystems, and then people are sort of not necessarily forced to choose, but they're sort of forced to either supply both of them or to choose in the case of something like Huawei, to choose sides on this. So anyway, so it wasn't an exact sort of analogy, but it's been sort of picked up, and of course the media sort of picked up on it. Anyway, so I think when we look at this problem, I mean, there's so many angles to it, but basically, there's sort of several baskets that you can put this under, and some of them usually start with the trade dispute and all the many issues that raised about engagement with China and whether China can sign up to international treaties and agreements and abide by them. So the whole issues around the Section 301 investigation, which if you haven't read it, it's kind of an amazing document. But in any case, that. There's a lot of issues in there that still aren't dealt with, and the Biden team will have to figure out how to do this going forward, and we'll do that in a very different way, I think. But there are things like market access subsidies, IP protection, and forced tech transfer, and there's some progress on all those. And China has made a lot of progress, for example, on intellectual property protection. Is it perfect? No, but these key areas like market access and subsidies are things that are going to be huge things going forward in the relationship. Particularly in the key sectors like semiconductors, and then market access is huge. I mean, what U.S. companies, for example, really wanted out of this trade deal was some kind of easing of restrictions around cloud services, because this is sort of the future, right? A lot of these issues about IP protection are viewed as sort of issues of the past, and so companies looking forward are saying, hey, what about these joint venture requirements for cloud? How do we deal with that? And they were starting to get to these, but they didn't really have the right negotiating team to deal with it, because the issue was much more complicated than and beyond trade almost in some sense. And then the second issues are sort of in the U.S. that have come up in the last couple of years. National security, particularly in the Trump administration, the equating of national security and economic security, and so this gets to things like supply chains, too much dependence on China on supply chain side. DoD is very hard over on this. They did a study, and the dependence of their critical supply chains on some China nexus was so high that they classified the number. And so that's a big concern that's been growing. And then there's things like rare earths and all sorts of pieces to that people the people now realize, gee, maybe the U.S. shouldn't be so dependent on China for these things. So there's that piece of it that's sort of come to the fore under the Trump administration. A lot of effort in that direction. So those are two sort of issues that are sort of you could argue are issues of the long-standing of the past that are sort of coming up. And then there's a couple new issues that sort of relate to the future. And the first is sort of the perception or the meme that came out in the Trump administration that China was sort of investing in or stealing or doing something with the technologies, cutting edge emerging technologies. And so this has led to major efforts around export controls and financial reviews of investment in the U.S., beefing up CFIUS and beefing up the U.S. export control regime. And that's an ongoing process that we'll see. Will be really interesting to see how the Biden team tackles that, and we can talk about that. But then I think the last and sort of one of the key themes that's really tough to sort of get your head around but it's out there on the loose, is this meme that the U.S. and China are somehow locked in this inexorable struggle over the technologies of the future, like AI and quantum computing, and whether advanced mobile telecommunications networks and even semiconductors, sort of cutting edge semiconductors. So, that's a really important thing, which is going to survive into the Biden administration as a sort of a zeitgeist, if you will. And the other corollary to that is that China, not only are we in this competition or race with China, but China is going to misuse these technologies in ways that are somehow inimical to Western democracies. So one of the arguments, for example, against Huawei and allowing Huawei to build 5G networks in Europe was the sense that, how can we allow the lifeblood of democratic civilization to run over equipment that's built by a company that's headquartered in China, where the legal and political system are things we have a lot of problem with in the West. And so that idea is gonna survive and will play into this idea, for example, of a transatlantic condominium around some of these key technology issues like data governance and industrial policy that will probably be at least given some attention in the early days of the Biden administration. There's this idea of a D10, democratic countries that are aligned, and with this corollary that there's sort of building this higher wall around some of these things, with the idea that China would have to meet, and Russia with other countries would have to meet these high standards. And that's going to be tricky because the EU just came out this week with the Digital Markets Act, and there's digital services taxes and a whole bunch of issues that have to be sort of resolved. The Privacy Shield was struck down, and the US and the EU are negotiating on that right now. So there's a lot of issues between allies. But I think in general, under the Biden administration, there'll be a preference for collaboration and working through these issues rather than threatening tariffs. Please don't put tariffs on my French wine over an issue like digital services tax, right? I don't know if I can handle that one. So there'll be a lot of, at least, I think there'll be a honeymoon in the Biden administration until, because there are some forces, for example, in Europe that do, really want to stick it to the big platforms, Google and Facebook and others. So there is a sort of a growing movement to regulate big U.S. tech companies and tech platforms that is gaining momentum in Europe. So that's sort of the bigger picture. And then, I think that the really fascinating thing will be what the Biden, how this new administration tackles these, because I think, there's just, it's really critical that to see how they're gonna approach these issues, because they all again have this sort of U.S.-China piece to them. They're affecting that conflict has affected all of Asia. Taiwan has been dragged into this, and the potential for conflict over Taiwan is something we've been trying to highlight as a possibility, in part because of the semiconductor industry. But but all these issues around U.S. and China end up becoming a sort of global piece, because China is pushing, for example, the Belt and Road into Africa and Latin America, and the digital Silk Road, and then almost any issue you can think of, immediately there's a sort of there's a multilateral or plurilateral piece to it, whether it's trade or or sort of broader export control or investment policy. So I think the Biden team, and that's really early on here, but I think there's going to be a big change in what I would say is style, substance, and structure. So there's a real recognition that the goalposts have changed. So we're not going to go back to some Obama era, this idea of talking with China and not having any sort of way to enforce any kind of agreement, that's going to be nobody thinks that there's going to be a return to that. But there'll be this, at least a dumbing down initially of the sort of rhetoric around China. I mean, I think people may not appreciate, but when you've had in this administration, just in the last few months, 4 very senior people all give speeches on China and the sort of existential threat posed by China. You have Barr, Attorney General Barr, you have FBI Director Wray, you have National Security Advisor O'Brien, and then culminating with Mike Pompeo's speech at the Nixon Library, very symbolic, last summer, basically, calling China out as this existential threat going forward, and sort of, the Kennan style, all these things that are being bandied about in terms of China. So I think there'll be a return to sort of, a sense of not wanting to go there, wanting to build back something into the relationship that will be constructive, like climate change and, cooperation on climate change and the pandemic. I mean, when I was in government, I worked on a team that supported Vice President Gore, who only cared about climate change and working with China on climate change. So I remember those heady days, long ago. But I think there'll be a return to that, to finding some balance in the relationship, at the same time as realizing that there are a lot of challenges that have to be dealt with, whether it's on the trade front or in some of these other technology areas where the perception is that China has these unfair advantages, and is eating the U.S. lunch in a lot of areas. So that's going to happen. So the style will be a little bit less rhetoric, not calling all STEM students in the U.S. Chinese spies. And then on the substance side, there'll be all this return to sort of China expertise. Tons of people in D.C. that will be senior policymakers on the China front. You could have Kurt Campbell coming back, for example, and heading up a team that might have Jeff Prescott and Eli Ratner, a sort of bad cop, good cop thing on China. That's a sort of they've called this the Asia czar position, and that's one thing that's being bandied about. No, none of these positions have been chosen yet, but so there's going to be a restructuring then around China and around technology. So the U.S. government, the Biden team feels that the U.S. government doesn't have a structure that allows it to keep up with these technology developments and to really understand the impact of U.S. policies in key areas like semiconductors, for example. And so there'll be an attempt to restructure around both of those issues. So you might have a White House Office of Technology and critical technology and security, for example, as was proposed by Senator Mark Warner. A very serious proposal, actually, that got no traction in the Trump administration, but the Biden team is looking at that very actively, or also rehatting people at the National Security Council and giving them a more dual-hatted national security and economic security kind of a role. And then also making it easier for the private sector to weigh in on key issues. Some kind of a technology policy council at the White House. Eric Schmidt, a former Google CEO, has been kicking around in the transition process, and he could be somebody that could be part of that. So I think, and then the other issue is just making it easier for the U.S. government to bring in people from the private sector quickly and not have to go through so many onerous bureaucratic processes. So there'll be a real effort to beef up the ability of the government to tap into private sector expertise and knowledge, and also a willingness to listen, and then a structure within the U.S. government that's going to allow some better attention to these issues going forward, because I think that's been the problem. There's a lot of players in the bureaucracy, but there isn't any higher level organization at the White House level that can kind of knock heads. A good example of this is on 5G, where the U.S. has only just recently finally freed up some mid-band spectrum, in part because the military, the DoD guys who control a lot of that mid-band spectrum, are protecting their own interests, and there's been nobody above them to say, hey, going forward, it might be nice if for the U.S. economy, if some of this mid-band spectrum was released for 5G, and it's been a really painful process to have that happen, because the national security part of that has dominated the dialogue so much, and so I think there'll be a change in that sense of looking at this issue, and then looking at industrial policy going forward. So finally, There'll be a lot of support in the Biden team for things like reshoring advanced manufacturing. You saw this earlier this year, this TSMC agreement to build an advanced semiconductor fab, for example, in Arizona. That kind of thing will get a lot of attention and encouragement early in the Biden administration. But it's going to be hard because the U.S. hasn't done industrial policy for a long time, and so you're going to need some structure around that to ensure that there's some continuity there. I mean, the semiconductor industry piece, for example, this is a 10-year time frame where you need sustained support for for that industry if you're really going to reshore significant players and attract Samsung and others to follow TSMC's lead. That's going to, there's been a lot of good work done on that in the last days of this administration at Commerce and State, for example. But I think you need a broader vision of, what is the government role going to be here in semiconductors and 5G and AI and quantum. It's been sort of developing, but I think that's going to be one of the big priorities under Biden. And at the same time, they're going to be, the people doing this are very clear that any kind of domestic tech innovation policy is going to have to also be carefully tied into a foreign policy and around technology and around China and the EU. So I've talked to a lot of the people in the transition team that are going to be doing pieces of tech policy, and very impressed with the level of thinking around these issues and with the ability to deal with nuance and and realize that expertise, they need to really make sure they're getting really good advice. I'll give you just one example of that, where I did a paper for Johns Hopkins under the guidance of Richard Danzig, who's a former Undersecretary of Defense, and Avril Haines, who's the new DNI, and these were policy papers looking at U.S.-China tech decoupling in different sectors like semiconductors. I did the one on telecommunications, and they wanted a lot of policy prescription in that. So the last section of that paper is looking at 5G and standards and a whole bunch of issues around technology that the new administration will have to grapple with. One of them is on undersea fiber optic cables, which has become a big issue under the Trump administration, which is seeking to, for example, ban licenses or bar licenses for fiber optic cable landings in China because of concern about Chinese investors or operators on the other end. Now, the problem with that is there's a lot of need for undersea cables. 90% of the internet backbone is running on undersea cables, and there's a lot of they're very complex to build and take a long time to get regulatory approval. And cutting out a huge market like China from them it really messes with the economics in a big way. And then probably those cables are going to get built anyway. And so the end result might be that the US has less centrality to the internet going forward. And companies like Google and Facebook, for example, particularly Google, which is able to deftly play off the sort of network storage and connectivity, or the compute storage and connectivity angle, and so is able to offer very competitive and services that really benefit the whole internet. That whole equation would be called into question if some of these cables are going to be under pressure to get built, and China is going to somehow get shut out of that in the next 3 to 5 years. And so in my paper, I tried to address here's a challenge and here's sort of how to think about a tough problem like that. But just simply rejecting license applications because there's a Chinese player may not be the best way to go. There's other ways to handle security and around things like fiber optic cables. But that's another issue that I think that the Biden team is going to have to deal with, is this tendency now to sort of want to keep China and Chinese companies out of building internet infrastructure and participating in standard bodies, whatever. That's going to be a huge issue going forward, because there's still a lot of support for that in some quarters of Washington. But industry is very concerned about that be done in a careful and nuanced way. Otherwise, you're going to blow up the internet, which is already under a lot of other pressures going forward. So let me stop there. I've kind of covered a lot of ground. Happy to dive into any of these other issues, and certainly happy to hear what you guys think about all these things also, because I'm coming at it from 25 years in government where I was asked to view China as a threat, because as intelligence officers, when we smell roses, we think funeral first. But In my role in the private sector, of course, I'm working with a lot of the big players, companies that are building and operating and innovating across all of these technologies. And so I have a fairly different view of a lot of things, and of issues like national security and economic security, and properly balancing those on the policy side. So let me stop there.
No, Paul, that was great. Does anybody have a question that wants to start? Or I'm happy to. I'll get one going, Paul. This is such a complex and important issue at the same time. It's also a front page news story. It's also so much tied into like our investments and also our consumers. Where to start on this stuff? Like, what should people be reading, or what should they be digesting, or what should they be listening to try to get a balanced approach on this very complex relationship?
That's a good question, because I think there's the media reporting on these issues has tended to be, fairly, of course, negative on China for the last 4 years. I think if you did a sentiment analysis, I mean, most of it is very negative. So it's hard to get a sort of more balanced view of this. So a lot of the reporting on technology, for example, is around surveillance or use of technology for surveillance. There's not a lot of discussion about the use of AI in China for medical diagnosis, which is a huge and growing area, for example. So it's a good question, because I think there's a lot of good work being done on this at place. I think Politico is really good. Politico does a pretty good and more balanced job of writing. They're really beefing up their tech coverage too. So David Wertheim is doing a really good job there of trying to get sort of a reporting cadre there that can do this issue. It's tricky because when I'm trying to hire somebody for my practice, for example, at Eurasia Group, I ideally want somebody with some government experience, understands the policy realm, but also has a really deep understanding of a particular sector or region and the technology issues in that region. It's hard to find people that bring a lot of those kinds of things to the table. But there's a lot of good work being done. Also, a place like Macro Polo, which is Hank Paulson's think tank, basically. But they're people that are really good. The people who he's brought in there are really good. Some of them are former EG alumni, like Damien Ma, and Matt Sheehan, who's there, is a really, really good young up and coming guy who follows the AI space, for example, in China, and does really, really good work on this issue. So, and they're coming at it from a very balanced point of view, I think. And then also the Council on Foreign Relations does good work in this area. Adam Siegel, for example. So you end up, I think, the media coverage is pretty good in some areas. Like the Nikkei does a good job of covering China tech issues, for example. But I tend to read a lot of the industry kinds of publications that are very focused on the semiconductor industry or the telecom industry, and because they tend to be a little less biased, or sort of don't have as much spin. But it's a good question. How do you kind of get your head around this? I mean, we do a lot of sort of internal webinars and calls on this, where and then we're going to probably do, and we publish a lot of stuff on our website too, to try to get out some of the stuff we do on this. One of the other really good sites is Sup China, which is one of my go-to sites, because the Kaiser Guo there is really good, and he's again very balanced and critical of China in a lot of areas, but their coverage on the tech issues is very good, and also pretty balanced. So there's sort of a few good places to go out there, but the mainstream media is tricky, because I think there is this, like Paul Moser has written so much about, he focused only on like basically the surveillance side of things when he was in China, and did great work on it. But I think it gave a sort of a little bit distorted view of that issue in China in some areas, because it was such a big topic. It has been such a big topic over the last 2 years, particularly when you throw in things like China's repression of the minority population in Xinjiang and the use of technology in that context. It's gotten a lot of attention also. So it's hard to find a sort of more balanced view China technology, U.S.-China technology, and going forward. But I think again, the Biden people are going to be, you'll see a very different approach and a very different team in there that is pretty, is attempting to bring some back some nuance to the discussion. Great question.
Anybody else have a question? It's very surprising for there has to be one or two other questions. Eric, do you have a question?
I do. And
Eric, you should, for context, you should explain maybe, your experience, because you're actually on the ground sourcing.
Yeah, so I'll turn my camera on and everything so you can see my pretty face as well. One of the, not that anybody needs that. So Paul, I've been involved with China since 2002. I've worked with several manufacturers that, I was basically their U.S. sales piece while they developed their business here in North America. So I've been going to Beijing, Shanghai since I want to say 2002 timeframe, and there is no doubt that there has been tremendous changes in the country over that time. You still see the wood shackles around the buildings as they build up, but I mean, so some of it, and the state bird is still the crane. But, overall, there has obviously been a tremendous change. But one of the things you've kind of alluded to is that there hasn't been real balanced views. And I guess the question for me is there is no doubt that China has done significant work from a positive standpoint. You reference the AI on the medical side, some of the capabilities that they have in terms of criminal tracing. I mean, I remember watching a video. Basically, they drop somebody off anywhere, and within 2 minutes, they have them on camera and they can catch the guy. So those are fantastic from a surveillance and piece of that. But I guess having seen and kind of understanding it, I feel like I kind of understand it. Is that some of the criticisms of China, whether they just be like you just referenced the Uyghur population, whether it be the Huawei concerns, whether it be, quite frankly, what they're doing in Hong Kong with legislation, the reality to me is that the Chinese government is inexorably linked to their businesses. And so that I do think there has to be a very, very, and I don't know if nuance is the right word, but there needs to be a really light touch in terms of what we allow, because honestly, China has aspirations much greater than being better than the United States. I mean, they truly do. And they don't really see, I mean, I guess I'm trying to get to is how do we balance that? Because quite frankly, the government is heavily involved in their industry and what they're doing, and surveillance and espionage. I mean, it's just reality.
Right. No, it's a great question. And one of the things I meant to throw in there is that, part of the whole issue here is that up until Xi Jinping took power in 2012, there was this perception that the system was evolving into a more open system and, allowing more dissent and et cetera. Right. And then all of a sudden Xi comes in and, clamps down on online dissent and the big guys, there are all these big internet people are very popular on the internet. And he sort of really closed the space, the sort of public space for more openness and more debate about certain issues. And then, of course, a lot of other policies that he's put in place. I mean, all these big things that the U.S. has reacted to, like Made in China 2025 and Belt and Road, and all these national plans. The perception is that yes, the Chinese government is sort of reasserting control, and even more recently, of course, there's been a lot of issues around the Ant. The Ant IPO is an example of course, that apparently Xi got really mad at Jack Ma for comment the kibosh on the world's biggest IPO, right? I mean, that's a huge thing, right? And lots of other factors there were playing into that. I think probably a bigger factor was the fear of all the speculation that was happening around that, and the fear of sort of that if the whole thing went bust, you'd have a lot of people losing their life savings on Ant. But in any case, you're exactly right, though, that the government role in the economy and in companies is really tricky to differentiate. I would argue, though, that it's the Chinese private sector companies that are the most innovative and sort of almost they're succeeding despite the government, right? And so those are the companies, and they're if they're going to succeed globally, for example, they're going to have to figure out a way to not be so closely identified with the Chinese government, which is going to be really tough. But like companies like Alibaba and Tencent and even Huawei, that are operating in Europe, they're going to have to figure out how for example, their data practices are consistent with European regulation. And they claim to, for example, to be compliant with the GDPR, but of course China itself will never be, in the near term, will never be deemed adequate under something like the GDPR. So I think what my sense is that the way to approach this is something through, it's sort of like tough love, or whatever, if you want. So figure out ways where the relationship can be, where there can be collaboration to stop the sort of downward spiral where everything China does is somehow viewed as negative. The Mike Pence speech at the Hudson Institute was a good example of just this litany of things, and some of them were absolutely I agreed with. Others I thought were a little bit over the top and maybe overreactions. But I think the approach needs to be multilateral. So, for example, in the trade space, China has just signed up for RCEP, which is a really important development. And then Xi Jinping actually said that they were seriously looking at CPTPP, joining CPTPP. Now that's huge because that would require a really huge structural change in the way China operates, right? I mean, and things like data localization and other things. So the approach of sort of making these things like these regional trade agreements attractive to China, and then raising a very high bar, right, that China would have to meet over time, that sort of approach, I think, is something that's, and again, it has to have a longer term view here, because, the Chinese argument that they're a developing country, et cetera, and, they need these, this is the argument they made with WTO. I mean, these things have to be really handled in a very methodical and sort of professional approach. And this is what the U.S. was doing in the trade negotiations, right? Those were very serious negotiations that were trying to get China to agree to these changes and then put in place an enforcement mechanism so that those could actually be enforced. That turned out to be very difficult. But I think if that is done in a more multilateral way, and being very tough, I think that's at one level that's an approach I think that a return to that approach I think is gonna get to some of those challenges you mentioned, and things like Xinjiang and Hong Kong. Yes, I mean the U.S. government has taken a lot of action already, in terms of sanctions and other actions against Chinese individuals and organizations. And the question of whether that's going to make any difference in those very difficult sort of political arenas is another question. But yeah, I mean I think you have to couple sort of a desire to collaborate in some areas and then tackle those really tough issues, because otherwise, if you're just going to if you're just going to sort of get into this tit for tat and this downward cycle, and where there's no trust at all between the two governments, then it's pretty ugly if you play that out, and then you start talking about clashes over Taiwan or other things that are really very not desirable for anybody in the business community or otherwise. So I think the problem is finding some sort of way to deal with China that doesn't sort of blow up the relationship in a way that is sort of irreparable, and that's where I think the Biden people are going to be searching for that. It's not going to be easy. It's going to be really hard. But I think that there's been criticism of them that they're going to be too easy and go back to some sort of situation where they're going to be just back to sort of where the Obama administration was. And I think that's totally wrong. I think that they're going to be very tough, but they're going to just approach the whole problem in a more holistic manner, so that these tech policies, for example, will be situated within a broader China strategy that makes sense to industry. So, okay, here's the things we're going to protect from a national security point of view, for example, and here's other things we're going to allow because they're not as sensitive. So I think there'll be a really well thought out strategy that's unrolled here. But it's this is a long-term problem here. I think my view is, having lived through Tiananmen Square, so I saw China in 1989 go from party in control of everything to a lot of chaos on the streets and a desire for a significant change. So, there's always this sort of undercurrent in China that comes out with the Tiananmen Papers and other documents. There is a group in China of mid-level bureaucrats that do want to see China become, more of a mainstream sort of player here, and see does that, if that means overthrowing the party, that's a whole other issue. But
we know where that ends up.
What?
We know where that ends up. That ends up with guys in mid-level bureaucracy roles.
Right.
I just I respect your forward-thinking look in terms of the positive of what the Biden administration may be able to bring to the table. It's all kind of conjecture at this stage. We'll see what we can. If I look at it and say, okay, what happened with China between 2008 and 2016? Quite frankly, it was kind of a runaway locomotive that nobody within the Obama administration wanted to slow down at all. And there were some positives to that. So I'm not completely bashing it. Quite frankly, it benefited me tremendously individually. So I'm reasonable about that. I look at who we're working with, though, is the Xi administration isn't changing until he wants it to change at some point, indeterminate in the future. So, I look at that. How do we try and separate those pieces out when China really does have like they have a policy. They look at our long-term plan is 1,000 years. Here in the United States, we got Q2. That's just the difference. Right. Different culturally, and so when you try and compare those things and bring them together, it's really complicated. And I don't know if, especially, I'll speak for North America. I see Daniel at the bottom drinking wine, so I'm thinking he might be in Europe or somewhere outside the United States. If not, God bless you, because I should be joining him. But when I look at this United States, we don't look at anything long term. Literally, we are so quarterly driven that even as individuals, I think it becomes really complicated when you're trying to negotiate with a culture that looks at long-term plans in 1,000-year increments, and we look at it in what's going to happen between now and Q2.
Yeah, I think that's a fair. The Chinese do take a very long-term view, but I think the problem with that is also that it doesn't account also for the messiness of the Chinese system. It's not as though they're these, all-seeing people, at the top who can sort of map are planning this long-term strategy that is all clearly mapped out. It's a lot more complicated than that. Just for example, this AI strategy document that came out in 2017, it called for China to dominate AI by 2030, right? And I was in Beijing shortly after that, and I talked to some of the drafters, and they admitted this thing was way OBE'd the moment it was out the door, right? Because they didn't even account for things like semiconductor and AI optimized semiconductors weren't even in the plan, or the strategy. And pretty quickly the industry has moved in that direction, for example. And so, I think we have to be careful to overreact to a lot of the rhetoric in China around the national aspirations, because those are designed for domestic consumption to sort of galvanize the bureaucracy to try to deal with a particular problem. But if you look like something like semiconductors, for example, what's the most successful semiconductor in China after the government has thrown literally tens of billions of dollars at that industry? It was Huawei's design arm, HiSilicon, which is operating in a market environment with very serious competitors, and they did that without the government telling them to do that. They had to compete, and so they developed the HiSilicon capability, and they attracted really good engineers, and then they were designing semiconductors on par with Qualcomm, right, within a fairly short time, right? And that had nothing to do with government planning, right? Other than yes, the Beijing wants more, capability in the semiconductor industry, but that was so. The problem with the government sort of now the increased government role in all these high tech sectors is, that's not going to really lead to more positive outcomes, right? The semiconductor industry is a perfect example where they've in the manufacturing side, for example, they're 10 years behind. Look at any sector, EDA tools. Materials, all these different pieces that make up a semiconductor industry, for example, they're way behind on domestic, and they can't do it themselves. No country in the world has ever tried to recreate all those value chains. Now China has a huge market. You can argue, well, maybe they're sort of unique in that sense, but that's the problem is that's just not. They're never in some areas of semiconductors. They're never going to catch up. right? I mean, there's not. They're not going to be able to out design ASML in the advanced lithography realm, right? They're just never going to do it. So, and I think there are people in China who get that. So they even though there's a lot of rhetoric around self-reliance and all these things, the reality is in the industry is that, that people recognize this isn't going to happen. And so more government investment in these tech sectors is really not, in my mind, going to necessarily make a difference. They're also, at the same time, of course, trying to get more market mechanisms. The star market in Shanghai is a good example. And then recently you've had some failures of semiconductor companies, right? Some serious failures where, companies just clearly didn't have the technology or the management and didn't really have a market that they were trying to address. And they just sort of went out of business, or they're failing. And the government is very concerned about that. So they're, the NDRC, they're sort of state planning guys are looking at, gosh, there's overinvestment in the sector, and maybe all these people jumping in, for example, are are not really capable of doing real things in that sector. So there's a huge amount of inefficiency in the system. So I think Jeff Prescott made a good comment on this. He may be a key guy on China and Asia under Biden. You could have this thing with Kirk Campbell and Eli and Jeff, and he said something about the inherent messiness of the Chinese system, which is, yes, they do have this long-term thinking, but that, depending on what you're talking about, that sort of founders in certain key areas where they just it doesn't matter that they want to be less dependent on foreign companies by 2025 in all these sectors of semiconductors. They're never going to, those goals are never going to be achieved. So I think again, maybe on the US side, having a longer term view of this also, because I think as a younger generation in China comes into power at different parts of the bureaucracy, that has been educated in other areas, I still see that the potential for change there is pretty high. I mean, if you look at again where China, when I first went to China in 1988, I came out of the railway station in Guangzhou and everybody was wearing a Mao suit, right? And probably that reflected also their thinking in to some degree. And that's within my. It's not that long ago, really, right? And so when I go back to China now, and I go to Shenzhen, the Greater Bay Area, I spent 2 weeks before the pandemic in the Greater Bay Area, and I was blown away. It's a young, vibrant culture there. They're far away from Beijing, and they're innovative. And people there. It's a really amazing place. It's very different from Beijing and Shanghai. And you got Hong Kong across the way with its problems, but still a lot of influence in Hong Kong in terms of the legal system and the sort of entrepreneurial environment. A lot of tech companies in Shenzhen had a lot of input from Hong Kong, for example. So when you go to a place like that, you see, wow, there's a potential future for China here, a very vibrant environment where yes, it's still part of China, but it's a very different piece of China, and the thinking there is very different than in other places like Beijing and Shanghai, which tend to be more conservative and sort of a little more, remind me of when I went to China in 1988, where Shenzhen is just so different. That whole part of the country and that whole Guangzhou and the whole Greater Bay Area is just very different. At one level from the rest of the country. So I think there's, the problem with China is, anything you say about, there's always sort of a counterexample. But I think, my view is still going from having seen China evolve from 88 and 89, Tiananmen Square. I was right in the middle of it. I saw Tiananmen Square on the ground in China. I had to leave actually on June 6th, after June 4th. I was teaching at a university in Xi'an where there was a lot happening. So this, the potential for sudden change or for, both sudden and gradual change in China is clearly still there. So you have to be careful to sort of project linearly forward that, Xi Jinping and his view of things is going to sort of prevail into the distant future. I mean, I think there's still a lot of ferment we don't even see under the surface. If you just look at some, these documents are where people were very uncomfortable with what's going on in Xinjiang that were leaked And this Communist Party list of members was leaked. The system is there's a lot of, I think, a more change under the surface than we might think. Now, how that manifests itself is going to be tricky, but there is, I think, the view of China as sort of this monolith that is locked into this model development. I just think is probably one we have to handle with kid gloves.
Hey, Paul, I'm mindful of time. We're 48 after. So, are you keen to do? Maybe we'll do one more question. Are you keen for that?
Great question, Eric. I'd like to talk further about that. Yeah.
Paul, would you be up for? He's been on the front line, so it'd be a good connection.
I was just saying, I'd love to as well, just because it's always good to get a view that's more than Again, I'm working with three or four manufacturing companies located between Beijing and Fuzhou, Xiamen area, and so obviously I've seen the very different. So when you reference Shenzhen and Guangdong, completely different than the Fuzhou Xiamen region, which is I'm going to go to a beach town, which is bizarre. It's a huge tech center within China itself. So, but I'd love to talk further about it because I think it'd be an interesting conversation. I could probably learn a lot.
Yeah. Well, we should link up on. We can use link up on LinkedIn or through.
You got it.
You guys.
You got it.
Great.
Thank you.
I think Eric's on TikTok.
Send me a video.
Ben Schobert, do you want to ask a question?
Paul, it's always good to hear from you. And I apologize.
Hey, Ben.
I apologize if you answer this question. I had a call come in that I had to take urgently. I'm always curious to hear someone like yourself speak to what extent is the ability of the American government to influence China right now ultimately limited by what China perceives to be a very messy and dysfunctional political system in the United States that frankly isn't generating very good returns for the American worker, for the American middle class. And so that's I think my first question. I think at a very tactical level, does that in any way shape the Chinese government's unwillingness to pursue the sort of regulatory harmonization, the sort of very industry specific alignments that over the last 30 years we have seen actually be good for innovation, be good for globalization? So it's a higher order political question that I'm curious about your answer about that. But then also, does that in turn express itself in these very peculiar technical regulatory issues that you have developed all this expertise in?
Wow, that's a really that's a great question. I think it's tricky because I think that there are these people in China like Liu He, who, for example, who was the lead trade negotiator, who is very savvy when it comes to both how the U.S. system works and what its limitations are, and what's the sort of art of the possible in China. And so, at one point in these trade negotiations, he developed and his team is very good. I've met some members of his team. From the Ministry of Finance. These are young, sort of very savvy people who are working in this very complicated political environment, but who, during the trade negotiations, they developed a really good relationship with Lighthizer and his team that was really unusual. It was at one point the only thing working in the relationship, right? And lots of problems there, right? And one of the miscalculations was that on the U.S. side, I think, was that if Liu He had been given this mandate by Xi Jinping to sort of probe into some of these really tough areas and make a deal, and then of course when one of the first drafts of the deal went back to Beijing, and some of the conservative ministries, more conservative ministries, looked at this and kind of balked, it sort of ended up contributing to the thing blowing up. But those are I think there is a group there of people that the so-called moderates in China that do want to tackle these tough issues, these tough strategic issues, but they're working within this very difficult environment where, particularly when there's no trust in the U.S. and there's all these other things going on. I mean, the ironic thing here is the trade deal was a really serious effort to make changes in China and leverage. They use the U.S. government leverage, and whether it was tariffs or whatever, to do this. But at the same time, around this trade negotiation, there was chaos. right? There was chaos in the administration, and there were all these other policy actions that were working to support the sort of more conservative elements in China that says, hey, you know, these guys are really out to get you, and sort of ended up undermining the trade negotiations. So at one level, this was the first administration that had really tried to tackle these tough issues in a concerted way, and with bringing to bear real, you know, enforceable kinds of, you know, White House was adamant about this, you know, that having a real enforcement mechanism here. But at the same time, the whole rest of the administration, including the president, was working essentially to undermine, you know, that effort. And so I think that's where, again, a Biden administration is gonna tackle this, and I think with the same rigor, but it will be with the sort of multilateral approach. But you know, now you've got a different China that we're dealing with 2 years ago, and that's going to be the challenge, because you know, the Trump years have sort of unleashed the dragon again internally, that they don't want to be in that position again of being, you know, having their leading companies cut off, or their, you know, so they're gonna push some of the policies that ironically led to the whole to some, you know, the trade dispute in the first place. So yeah, I mean, it's the problem is that that the system, the Chinese system, is just, you know, it's kind of Xi has retained so much power at his level and over the system that it's hard to see, you know, people like Liu He, you know, being able to make a difference and to attack some of those structural changes that have been, you know, bedeviling the relationship for a long time. But again, I think the interesting thing in the next 4 years will be to see if, you know, how Xi Jinping, you know, whether he survives this. I mean, I think there's still a lot of criticism internally to this. We saw this last year when the whole trade issue was at its height. There was so much criticism internally of his leadership of the whole thing, and so, you know, the hard thing to predict about China is, you know, when something happens, like I go back at Tiananmen Square. Yeah, nobody thought that the death of this particular individual would trigger that, you know, this huge upheaval. But you know, there was so much underlying, you know, ferment, as it turned out, that it sort of lit the spark there. So, you know, that's the kind. I think the problem is that's probably what's gonna have to happen for there to be real fundamental change in sort of the short term, is some sort of another major upheaval within the political system where, you know, the opposition to the current regime is seen as, you know, which is seen as sort of screwing up the relationship with the U.S. and sort of alienating other allies, potential allies. You know, it sort of drives some sort of action internally. But yeah, you raise a great question, and I think the you know, getting back to the sort of that situation where there was all this beneficial collaboration, and you know, that's going to be tough, because I think there's still particularly on the U.S. side, the Washington consensus, you know, may not survive in the exact same form in the Biden administration, but you know, the Congress and within Congress and other places, there's still no appetite, you know, to sort of, nobody's standing up and saying, hey, let's go easy on China. Right? I mean, everybody is still, so we have working through that and getting back to some constructive relationship that includes a real serious trade negotiation and collaboration on climate change and the pandemic is at least where things I think will have to start. And then from there, it's going to be tricky.
Well, Paul, thank you so much. This was a fun way to spend an hour. I feel like, yeah, we were talking about being an expert on China. It's endlessly interesting, and it's fascinating, especially to see the whole arc. And I'm glad we had a good cross section of folks on this call, which I think is really important. I think the more, especially us that live in democracies, the more we talk about China and get sober and have exchanges, I think it's better for all our countries. So I appreciate you taking the time. If folks want to reach out to you, can I share your email, or what's the best way to?
Absolutely. Yeah.
Okay, perfect.
I'm on LinkedIn and you know, Twitter, whatever. I try to keep my Twitter feed very carefully curated, but yeah, I'm happy to you know, share. We write on a lot of these topics, and I'm happy to share stuff we write if there's interest. We don't, you know, we're allowed to share the kind of things we write. We share them with reporters and other people. But if there's a particular issue, semiconductors, whatever, I'm happy to engage in further dialogue and share our sort of views on these issues as we look forward to January 20th.
January 20th. Well, I appreciate it. Hopefully, I will see you face to face in real life in sometime in 21.
Yes, I hope everybody. I mean, this is getting to be tough here. The Zoom and Zoom is great, and this is Google Meet. This is Google.
Google Meet. Yeah, I wanted to add a new wrinkle. So there's another tool for everybody to learn.
Yeah, Google's good. I think I put Zoom, Google, Microsoft Teams, and then WebEx. That's my top 4. No. Nobody likes,
that's another endless debate. Figuring out China is probably easier than figuring out web camera situations. All right, everybody. Thanks a lot, Paul. Thanks again. We'll see everybody. Thanks.
Thanks, guys.
Thank you.
Thanks for getting out, Christy.